The conference hall on Valdrin Prime was built to intimidate. Its ceiling stretched up into darkness, and the walls were carved from black stone taken from 100 conquered worlds. Ambassador Ryan Wells walked across the polished floor, his footsteps echoing in the massive chamber. He was a small figure in this place, and the Valdrin High Council wanted him to feel that way. The council members sat on elevated thrones, looking down at him with expressions of barely concealed contempt. Their skin was pale gray, their eyes dark and cold. They had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and they viewed humans as nothing more than useful primitives. High Counselor Thrain spoke first, his voice booming through the hall. Ambassador Wells, you have been summoned to receive the new tribute requirements for your species. Earth and its colonies will now provide 50% of all extracted resources to the Imperium. You will also transfer all advanced technology to our research facilities. Additionally, you will conscript 5 million of your young adults for service in the Imperial Army. Ryan stood silent for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. Behind him, 2 human guards stood at attention. They were the only other humans allowed in this chamber. He had prepared for this moment for months, working with Admiral Kate Sullivan and the Resistance leadership. Everything depended on what happened next. High Counselor, Ryan said, his voice steady and clear. I have been authorized by the United Earth government to deliver a formal response to your demands. Thrain leaned forward, a thin smile on his face. I trust it is a message of compliance. Ryan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small data chip. He held it up for the council to see. This contains our complete response. However, I have been instructed to summarize it for you personally. He took a breath, knowing that his next words would change everything. Humanity rejects your demands in their entirety. Furthermore, we demand that the Valdrin Imperium cease all exploitation of human worlds immediately. You have 30 days to withdraw all military forces from our systems and recognize our full sovereignty. If you fail to comply, there will be consequences. The silence that followed was absolute. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Thrain began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and grew into a roaring sound that filled the chamber. The other council members joined in, their laughter mixing together into something cruel and mocking. Consequences, Thrain finally said, wiping his eyes. You dare to threaten the Valdrin Imperium? Your species has 4 systems. 4 we control thousands. Your fleet consists of modified cargo vessels. We command 10,000 warships. What possible consequences could you impose upon us? Ryan placed the data chip on the floor in front of him. You have 70 years of occupation records from Earth. In that time, have you ever wondered why we never fought back? Why a species that achieved spaceflight through sheer determination simply accepted subjugation? Because you were wise enough to recognize your place in the natural order, Thrain said. No, Ryan replied. Because we were buying time. He turned and walked toward the exit. The guards fell in step beside him. The chip contains detailed proof of what I'm telling you. You have 30 days. I suggest you use them wisely. Back on Earth, Commander Jack Morrison stood on the observation deck of the orbital station Unity, watching the planet slowly rotate below. He was a tall man with gray streaks in his dark hair, a veteran of countless small skirmishes against Valdrin patrols. Now he was about to lead humanity's fleet into its first real battle. Admiral Kate Sullivan joined him at the window. She was shorter than Jack, but she carried herself with the authority of someone who had earned every rank through hard decisions and harder sacrifices. The Valdrin response just came in, she said. They're sending a punitive fleet. 200 warships. They'll be here in 6 days, Jack nodded slowly. Right on schedule. Are our forces ready? As ready as they'll ever be, Kate said. Helen's weapon systems are all operational. The crews have been training for this their entire careers. But Jack, even with everything we've built, 200 warships is a lot. They think we're helpless, Jack said. That's our advantage. They're coming here to put on a show, to make an example of us. They won't be ready for a real fight. Deep beneath the surface of Mars, Dr. Helen Carter was running final checks on weapon systems that had taken decades to develop. The facility stretched for miles in every direction, carved out of the red rock and hidden from orbital sensors. Thousands of scientists and engineers worked around the clock, preparing humanity's secret arsenal. Helen was a thin woman with sharp eyes and hands that never stopped moving. She had spent 20 years of her life on this project, watching it grow from desperate theory into functional reality. The quantum disruption cannons hummed with power, their capacitors charged and ready. The relativistic missile tubes were loaded with projectiles that could punch through any armor the Valdrin had. And the stealth ships, beautiful and deadly, waited in their hidden bays. Her assistant, a young engineer named Danny Shaw, approached with a tablet. "Dr. Carter, we're getting readings from the solar system perimeter. The Valdrin fleet just entered sensor range. 207 ships, all capital class or larger." Helen nodded. "Inform Admiral Sullivan. And Danny, activate the Defiance and all support vessels. It's time." The Valdrin fleet approached Earth with the confidence of conquerors. Fleet Commander Zarin stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking at the primitive planet on his display. He had fought in 30 campaigns of subjugation and never lost a single battle. This would be simple. The humans would see his fleet, realize the futility of resistance, and surrender. "Sir, we're approaching the orbital defense perimeter," his tactical officer reported. "Sensors show minimal defensive installations. No significant fleet presence." Zarin smiled. "Broadcast on all human frequencies. Tell them they have 1 hour to transmit their unconditional surrender, or we will begin orbital bombardment of their military installations." The message went out, transmitted across every channel. On Earth, billions of people watched their screens, waiting. The hour passed in tense silence. No surrender came. Zarin's expression hardened. "Very well. Target their orbital stations. Prepare to fire." That's when space tore apart around them. The human fleet appeared as if materializing from nothing, their stealth systems dropping all at once. The Defiance, humanity's first true warship, emerged directly above the Valdrin flagship. It was smaller than the enemy vessels, but sleek and deadly, its hull lined with weapons the Valdrin had never seen before. Jack Morrison's voice came across the communication channels, calm and clear. "Valdrin Fleet, this is Commander Jack Morrison of the United Earth Defense Force. You have entered sovereign human space with hostile intent. You have one chance to withdraw. If you fire a single shot, we will destroy you." Zarin stared at the display in shock. Where had these ships come from? His sensors had shown nothing, and now there were dozens of human warships surrounding his fleet. He recovered quickly, his pride taking over. "You dare?
All ships, open fire!"
Destroy them." The Valdrin fleet opened up with every weapon they had, plasma bolts and kinetic rounds filling the space between ships. But the human vessels moved like nothing Zarin had ever seen, dodging and weaving through the fire with impossible agility. And when they returned fire, the results were devastating. Quantum disruption beams lanced out from the Defiance, touching a Valdrin cruiser. The ship's hull simply came apart, molecules losing their bonds, the entire vessel dissolving into clouds of component atoms. Relativistic missiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, striking with such force that they punched clean through shields and armor, leaving massive holes through the centers of their targets. Lieutenant Chris Baker led his fighter squadron through the chaos, his small craft dancing between capital ships. The fighters were equipped with experimental jump drives that let them blink short distances instantaneously, appearing behind enemy vessels to deliver precision strikes against vulnerable systems. Chris had trained for this moment his whole life, and now he executed his maneuvers with perfect precision. The battle lasted 3 hours. It felt like 3 lifetimes to the men and women fighting it. The Valdrin fleet, so confident when it arrived, was torn apart by weapons they couldn't understand and tactics they couldn't counter. Ships exploded or came apart or simply went dark, drifting hulks in the black. When it was over, only 12 Valdrin ships remained intact, and Zarin gave the order to retreat. His flagship was badly damaged, but it could still jump to faster than light speeds. As they fled, he looked back at Earth, that primitive blue world, and felt something he had never experienced before in his long military career. Fear. On the Defiance, Jack Morrison watched the enemy flee and allowed himself one moment of satisfaction. Then he turned to his crew. "Get me a damage report and casualty count, and someone contact Admiral Sullivan. Tell her the message has been sent. Now we prepare for their response." On Earth, in the halls of government and in homes across the planet, people celebrated, but Kate Sullivan stood in her office looking at projections and star maps. This was just the beginning. The Valdrin would come again, and next time they would bring everything they had. The victory celebration on Earth lasted exactly 2 days before reality set in. Admiral Kate Sullivan called an emergency meeting of the Defense Council. and the mood in the room was grim despite their recent success. She stood at the head of the conference table, displaying holographic images of the Valdran Imperium's military strength. "We bloodied their nose," Kate said bluntly. "But let's not fool ourselves. The fleet we destroyed was a punitive force meant to intimidate us into submission. It represented less than 2% of their total military capability." General Lisa Hayes, commander of the Mars Defense Installation, nodded in agreement. She was a stocky woman with iron-gray hair and a reputation for brutal honesty. "Our intelligence suggests they'll respond with overwhelming force. We're talking thousands of warships, not hundreds." Jack Morrison sat at the table, still wearing his uniform from the Defiance. He hadn't slept in 30 hours, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "How long do we have?" "Best estimate? 3 to 4 weeks, Kate replied. "They'll need time to mobilize, and they'll want to make sure they bring enough force to guarantee victory. The question is whether we use that time to fortify Earth's defenses or take the fight to them." Dr. Helen Carter spoke up from her seat. Her hands were clasped on the table in front of her, and there was a fierce determination in her voice. "We can't win a defensive war. Our industrial capacity is a fraction of theirs. Every ship we lose is irreplaceable in the short term. Every ship they lose barely makes a dent in their reserves. So what do you suggest?" General Hayes asked. "We go on the offensive," Helen said. "We use the stealth technology and hit their infrastructure before they can fully mobilize. Shipyards, supply depots, fuel refineries. We make them afraid to gather their fleet in one place." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Finally, Jack spoke. "Operation Firestorm. We've been planning it for years, hoping we'd never have to use it. Looks like the time has come," Kate nodded slowly. "If we commit to this, there's no going back. We'll be painting targets on every human world. The Valdran will stop seeing this as putting down a rebellion and start seeing it as an existential war." "They already see it that way," Jack said. "We just haven't admitted it to ourselves yet." The vote was unanimous. Operation Firestorm was approved. In the massive underground facility on Mars, workers scrambled to prepare the stealth fleet for deployment. The ships were beautiful in their own way, all smooth curves and dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Each vessel was equipped with the latest quantum stealth technology, making them nearly invisible to sensors. Lieutenant Chris Baker stood in the hangar bay, looking up at his fighter craft. The small ship was sleek and deadly, equipped with the experimental jump drive that had proven so effective in the recent battle. His squadron, 12 pilots total, would be providing support for the larger stealth destroyers. Captain Ben Tyler approached him, a tall man with a quiet demeanor that hid a brilliant tactical mind. Ben commanded the stealth destroyer Nightfall, the flagship of the stealth fleet. "Your squadron ready, Lieutenant?" "As ready as we'll ever be, sir," Chris replied. The jump drives performed well in combat, but using them for deep penetration missions is something else entirely. "We'll be operating in enemy territory with no support." "That's what makes it a stealth mission," Ben said with a slight smile. "Remember, our job isn't to fight fair. It's to hit them where they're not looking and get out before they know what happened." Across the fleet, 12 stealth destroyers and their support craft were making final preparations. Each ship had been assigned specific targets across Valdran space. The missions had been planned for years, waiting for the right moment. That moment had arrived. Dr. Alan Ross, the quantum physicist who had helped develop humanity's breakthrough technology, met with each ship's science officer personally. He was an older man, white-haired and scholarly, but his eyes burned with passion when he talked about the work. "The quantum disruption weapons are powerful, but they're also dangerous to the user," he explained to the crew of the Nightfall. "You need to maintain a minimum safe distance of 5 kilometers from the target when you fire. Any closer and the disruption field could cascade back to your ship." One of the young officers raised his hand. "Sir, what exactly happens to matter when it's hit by the disruption beam?" Alan's expression grew serious. "The molecular bonds simply cease to exist. The atoms don't explode or burn, they just stop holding together. A ship hit by the beam doesn't have time to explode. It just becomes a cloud of its component elements." He paused. "It's not a pleasant way to die, which is why we only use it against military targets." On Earth, Senator Greg Mason was making a passionate speech in the United Earth Assembly. He was a thin man with a sharp voice, and he represented a growing minority who questioned the military strategy. "We're about to launch attacks deep in Valdran territory," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. We'll be killing thousands, maybe millions of their people. How does that make us different from them? They oppressed us with violence, and now we respond with more violence. When does it end? President Claire Foster, newly elected just months before the war began, listened carefully from her seat. She was young for a president, in her early 50s, with dark hair and thoughtful eyes. When Greg finished, she stood to respond. Senator Mason raises valid concerns, Claire said, but we need to be clear about what we're facing. The Valdrin Imperium doesn't negotiate with equals. They only understand strength. If we show weakness now, they'll crush us and enslave any survivors. Our choice isn't between violence and peace. It's between fighting now while we have the advantage of surprise or waiting for them to bring overwhelming force to Earth. The vote on Operation Firestorm had already passed, but the debate continued. It would continue throughout the war, a necessary tension between military necessity and moral considerations. The stealth fleet launched from Mars under cover of a solar storm that masked their departure. They jumped to faster-than-light speeds, each ship heading to its assigned target. The journey would take days, time spent in the strange unreality of FTL travel. Ben Tyler sat in the captain's chair of the Nightfall, reviewing intelligence reports on his target. The Crander shipyards were one of the largest military construction facilities in Valdrin space, capable of producing 20 capital ships per year. Destroying them would set back the enemy's war effort significantly. His executive officer, a woman named Linda Brooks, joined him on the bridge. Captain, we'll be dropping out of FTL in 6 hours. All systems are green. Good, Ben said. Once we arrive, we'll have a narrow window. The orbital sensors will pick us up eventually, even with our stealth systems. We need to hit hard and fast. 6 hours later, the Nightfall emerged from FTL space on the edge of the Crandor system. The shipyards hung in orbit around a gas giant, massive structures that sprawled across hundreds of kilometers. Dozens of warships in various stages of construction filled the docks. All ships, this is Nightfall. Ben transmitted to his small task force. Execute attack plan Alpha. May fortune favor the bold. The stealth ships glided through space, silent and invisible. They positioned themselves around the shipyards, targeting specific structural points that Helen Carter's team had identified as critical. Then, in perfect synchronization, they fired. Quantum disruption beams lanced out, touching the support structures of the shipyards. The massive constructions simply came apart, their molecular bonds severed. Ships still in the docks tumbled into space, incomplete and helpless. Secondary explosions rippled through fuel storage tanks and reactor cores. Chris Baker led his fighter squadron through the chaos, targeting the defensive platforms that were trying desperately to locate the attackers. His jump drive let him appear behind a platform, fire and disappear before return fire could reach him. It was like fighting ghosts, and the Valdrin defenders had no idea how to respond. The attack lasted 18 minutes. When it was over, the Crandor shipyards were gone, replaced by a slowly expanding cloud of debris. 23 capital ships under construction were destroyed, along with the infrastructure to build more. The Nightfall and its task force jumped back to FTL, leaving only destruction behind. Across Valdrin space, similar attacks played out. Commander Amy Chen led special operations teams in ground assaults on 3 colony worlds, sabotaging fuel refineries and communication hubs. The attacks were precisely targeted to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing military impact. On one world, Amy's team infiltrated a military command center and downloaded complete fleet deployments and strategic plans. The intelligence would prove invaluable in the coming weeks. Back on Earth, reports of the successful strikes came in one by one. Kate Sullivan watched the tactical display as red markers appeared across Valdrin space, each one representing a successful mission. Out of 12 strike forces, 11 had completed their objectives and returned safely. One ship, the stealth destroyer Whisper, was reported missing and presumed lost. Jack Morrison joined her in the command center. "We hurt them," he said quietly. "But they're going to be furious." "Good," Kate replied. "Furious enemies make mistakes. And we're going to—" Intelligence reached Earth within days of the Valdrin High Council's decision. The Imperial Armada was gathering at the Terminus Gate, and the numbers were staggering. 3,000 warships representing the military might of an empire that had never known defeat. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood in the war room staring at the tactical display with a grim expression. 3,000, she said quietly. Even with all our advantages, we can't fight that many ships in open space and win. Jack Morrison studied the star charts, his mind working through possibilities. The Terminus Gate was a natural gravitational anomaly, a region where space itself twisted in ways that normal physics couldn't explain. It was the main route from Valdran core space to the frontier regions where Earth was located. What if we don't fight them in open space? He asked. Kate turned to look at him. What are you thinking? The Terminus Gate. It's a defensive choke point. The gravitic instabilities make it dangerous to navigate, but they also make it a killing field for anyone who knows how to use them. Jack traced routes on the display with his finger. If we make our stand there, we control the battlefield. They'll have to come through the gate to reach us, and they'll be channeled into predictable approach vectors. General Lisa Hayes joined them at the display. It's risky. If we commit everything to the Terminus Gate and they break through, there's nothing between them and Earth. If they break through with 3,000 ships, it won't matter where we made our stand, Jack said. We'll have already lost. At least at the gate, we have a chance. Dr. Helen Carter was pulled into the planning session via video link from Mars. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes from weeks of non-stop work. The defensive stations we designed for the gate are ready. They're not pretty, but they'll work. The stations can tap into the gravitational currents and weaponize them. We can create zones of space that will tear ships apart. How many stations can we deploy? Kate asked. 16 are complete. Another 8 could be finished in 2 weeks if we push hard. Kate made her decision. We have 2 weeks to prepare. Jack, you'll command the Vanguard fleet. Lisa, you'll oversee the defensive station deployment. Helen, I need every weapon system you can give us operational and at the gate. This is where we make our stand. The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. Every human warship was pulled from patrol duty and sent to the Terminus Gate. The defensive stations, massive structures designed by Dr. Sophie Warren's engineering team, were towed into position around the gate. Each station was equipped with gravity manipulators that could direct the natural instabilities of the gate toward enemy vessels. Lieutenant Chris Baker spent the time drilling his squadron relentlessly. The fighter pilots would be crucial in the coming battle, using their jump drives to strike at vulnerable targets in the chaos. Chris pushed his people hard, but he also made sure they knew why. We're not just fighting for Earth, he told them during one briefing. We're fighting for the idea that small doesn't mean weak, that being peaceful doesn't mean being helpless. Every species in this galaxy that's been crushed by the Valdran is watching what we do next. Captain Ben Tyler's Nightfall was assigned to the Vanguard fleet, along with the other stealth destroyers. These ships would be humanity's scalpel, targeting command vessels and disrupting enemy formations. Ben spent his time reviewing Valdran tactical doctrine, looking for patterns and weaknesses to exploit. On Earth, the political debate continued. Senator Greg Mason stood before the United Earth Assembly once again, his voice carrying the weight of moral concern. We're committing every resource we have to this battle. What happens if we lose? We'll have nothing left to defend our home worlds. Perhaps we should consider negotiating, finding a diplomatic solution. President Claire Foster responded with unusual sharpness. Senator, the Valdran don't negotiate. They conquer or they destroy. We tried peace for 70 years, and they responded by demanding more tribute, more resources, more of our people. The time for diplomacy ended when they sent a fleet to bombard Earth. She paused, letting her words sink in. We fight at the Terminus Gate because it gives us the best chance of survival. Not certainty, but chance. That's more than we'd have if we waited for them to come to us. The Assembly voted to support the military strategy, but the margin was narrower than before. The war was taking a toll not just in resources, but in unity. At the Terminus Gate, Commander Luke Phillips supervised the final preparations aboard his battleship, the Retribution. The ship was one of humanity's largest, bristling with weapons and carrying a crew of 800. Luke was a veteran officer, calm under pressure and known for his ability to think clearly in chaos. His tactical officer, a young woman named Sarah Mills, approached with the latest sensor data. Commander, the Valdran fleet is 3 days out. They're moving in a standard battle formation. Capital ships in the center with escorts on the flanks. Luke studied the data. They're being cautious. They know we have stealth capabilities, so they're keeping their formation tight. He thought for a moment. That works to our advantage. Tight formations mean they can't maneuver easily in the gravitational currents. Vice Admiral Paul Grant, second in command of the human fleet after Jack Morrison, toured the defensive stations personally. Paul was older than most of the other senior officers, a gray-haired man with a kind face that masked a sharp strategic mind. He spoke with every station commander, making sure they understood the battle plan. Dr. Sophie Warren met him on Station 7, one of the largest defensive platforms. Sophie was young for someone with her level of responsibility, barely 30. But she had designed these stations from the ground up. Admiral Grant, the gravity manipulators are operating at full capacity. We can create kill zones that will shred anything that enters them. What about friendly fire? Paul asked. Our own ships will be operating in the same space. Sophie pulled up a holographic display showing safe approach vectors highlighted in green. As long as our forces stick to these routes, they'll be safe. The kill zones are marked in red. Anyone who enters a red zone, friend or enemy, won't survive. Let's make sure our people know where the red zones are, Paul said quietly. The Valdran Imperial Armada emerged from FTL space at the edge of the Terminus Gate system right on schedule. Fleet Marshal Corvin stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Domination, and surveyed the human defenses with satisfaction. The humans had indeed gathered their forces here exactly as predicted. They had perhaps 200 ships, maybe a few dozen defensive stations. Against 3,000 Valdran warships it would be a slaughter. Fleet formation advanced slowly, Corvin ordered. Sensors at maximum. Watch for their stealth ships. I want no surprises this time. The massive armada began to move forward, a wall of ships that filled space from one edge of the gate to the other. The human fleet waited, looking tiny and insignificant in comparison. Jack Morrison watched the enemy approach from the bridge of the Defiance. His crew was silent, tension thick in the air. They were outnumbered 15-1. The odds were impossible, but Jack had learned something important in his years fighting the Valdran. Impossible odds just meant you had to be smarter, faster, and more willing to take risks. All ships, this is Morrison, he transmitted across the fleet. Remember your training. Stay in the green zones, use the gravity currents to your advantage, and don't try to be heroes. We're not here to win a fair fight. We're here to make them regret coming to our space. The Valdran fleet entered the outer edge of the Terminus Gate's gravitational field. Immediately, their sensors began acting erratically. The natural instabilities of the gate played havoc with scanning equipment. Corvin frowned but ordered the advance to continue. They had plotted safe routes through the gate based on decades of charts. They knew where the dangerous currents were. What they didn't know was that Dr. Sophie Warren's defensive stations had shifted those currents. The first Valdran ships hit the modified gravity zones without warning. One moment they were advancing in formation. The next moment invisible forces grabbed them and began tearing them apart. Hulls buckled and twisted as tidal forces exceeded what even military-grade construction could withstand. Ships screamed across emergency channels as their crews felt the terrible pulling forces that preceded death. Evasive action, Corvin shouted. All ships, new vectors. But changing course in the Terminus Gate wasn't simple. The gravity currents were unpredictable, and adjusting your path could take you into even more dangerous zones. The Valdran fleet's tight formation, meant to prevent ambushes, became a liability. Ships collided with each other as they tried to maneuver in space that fought against them. That's when the human fleet attacked. Jack Morrison led the Defiance straight into the heart of the enemy formation, using the safe routes that Sophie had programmed into every human ship's navigation system. The quantum disruption weapons opened fire, and Valdran cruisers simply dissolved into clouds of atoms. Behind the Defiance, the rest of the human fleet followed, hitting targets of opportunity and then dancing away before the enemy could respond effectively. Chris Baker's fighter squadron executed a series of jump attacks, appearing behind Valdran command ships and destroying their. The collapse of the Terminus Gate sent shockwaves through both human and Valdran space. On Earth, the mood was bittersweet. They had stopped the Imperial Armada, destroying or disabling more than half of the 3,000 ships that had come to crush them. But the cost had been terrible. 32 ships lost, including the Defiance with Commander Jack Morrison aboard. Over 10,000 human lives ended in a moment when the gate collapsed. Admiral Kate Sullivan attended memorial services across the planet. She stood at attention while families grieved, while politicians gave speeches about noble sacrifice, while the military bands played sad songs. But inside, she was already planning the next phase of the war. Jack's sacrifice had bought them time, but time alone wouldn't win this conflict. President Claire Foster met with Kate in a private session, away from advisors and cameras. The president looked older than she had just weeks ago, the weight of war aging her rapidly. The Valdren have lost their main route to our space, but intelligence suggests they're looking for alternative paths. How long do we have? 6 months, maybe a year, Kate replied. The alternate routes through that region of space are longer and more dangerous. They'll need time to map them properly and establish supply lines. But they will find a way, Claire. And when they do, they'll come at us with everything they have left. Claire nodded slowly. Our production facilities are running at maximum capacity, but we can't replace what we lost at the terminus gate quickly enough. Helen tells me we're short on the rare elements needed for the quantum weapons. I know, Kate said, which is why we need to change our strategy. We can't win this war by ourselves. We need allies. In the aftermath of the battle, something unexpected began to happen across the Valdren Imperium. Word of humanity's stand spread through the subjugated species. The Valdren, who had seemed invincible for 3,000 years, had been bloodied. More than bloodied, they had been stopped. Species that had long ago given up hope of freedom began to whisper in secret. Some began to plan. On the industrial world of Theros, a species called the Kelvin had labored under Valdren rule for 600 years. They were skilled engineers, forced to build ships for their masters. When news of the terminus gate reached them, something stirred in their collective consciousness. The factory overseer, a Kelvin named Drex, called a secret meeting of the workers. The humans have shown us something we forgot, Drex said to the gathered crowd. The Valdren can be beaten. They're not gods. They're just another species with ships and weapons. And if the humans can stand against them with only 4 systems, what could we do with the resources of an industrial world? Within weeks, sabotage began appearing in the Valdren ships built at Theros. Small things at first, easy to mistake for manufacturing defects. A weakened hull support here, a miscalibrated weapons system there. The defects would only show up under combat stress, and by then it would be too late. Similar movements began on other subjugated worlds. The Valdren Imperium, so focused on gathering forces for another assault on humanity, failed to notice the rot spreading through its foundations. Admiral Kate Sullivan, informed of these developments by her intelligence network, saw an opportunity. She dispatched Ambassador Ryan Wells on a dangerous mission. He would travel secretly to these rebel worlds and offer them something the Valdren never had: technology, training, and the promise of mutual defense. Ryan Wells stood before a gathering of rebel leaders on the mining world of Corinth. Representatives from a dozen species had risked their lives to attend this meeting. Humanity doesn't want to rule you, Ryan said clearly. We don't want tribute or resources or soldiers. We want something much simpler. We want allies, partners, friends who will stand with us against tyranny. A representative of the Corinth miners, a being named Zale with copper-colored skin and 4 arms, spoke up. Why should we trust you? How do we know you won't become the new oppressors once the Valdren are defeated? Ryan had expected this question. You don't know. You can't know. Trust has to be earned through actions, not promises. So let me offer you this. We'll share our stealth technology with any species that joins us. We'll provide training and support, but we won't demand loyalty or tribute. If after the war you want to go your separate way, we won't stop you. We're fighting for the right to be free, and that means respecting your freedom too. The rebel leaders looked at each other. It was a gamble to trust these humans, but it was a bigger gamble to continue living under Valdren rule, especially now that the Imperium was wounded and angry. One by one, they agreed. Back on Earth, Dr. Helen Carter worked with General Lisa Hayes to establish training programs for the rebel forces. They couldn't give away all of humanity's technology. The quantum disruption weapons were too complex and required rare elements, but the stealth systems and basic tactical training could be shared. Lieutenant Chris Baker found himself assigned as an instructor, teaching alien pilots how to use jump-capable fighters. It was strange at first working with species that looked nothing like humans, but Chris quickly realized that the fundamentals of combat flying were universal. Fear, courage, determination, these things transcended species. One of his best students was a young Kelvin pilot named Tira. She was smaller than most of her species, but she had reflexes like lightning and an intuitive understanding of 3-dimensional combat. Why do you fight so hard? she asked Chris one day after training. The Valdren are far from Earth now. You could hide, rebuild, wait for them to forget about you. Chris shook his head. Because hiding isn't living. And because someone has to stand up to bullies or they'll just keep finding new victims. Today it's us they're trying to crush. Tomorrow it might be your people. Or another species we've never met. Better to stop them now. Tira nodded slowly, understanding. Teach me everything you know. I want to be ready when the Valdren come to Theros. On Valdren Prime, High Counselor Thrain was dealing with a crisis on multiple fronts. The loss of half the Imperial Armada was a military disaster, but the growing rebellion across subjugated worlds was potentially worse. The Imperium's strength had always been its ability to leverage the resources of conquered species. If those species started fighting back, the whole system would collapse. Fleet Marshal Corvin, who had survived the Terminus Gate by ordering retreat before the collapse, stood before the Council. His reputation was damaged, but he was still the most experienced military commander they had. We need to deal with the rebellions before we can address the human threat, Corvin advised. If we send our remaining forces against Earth and the rebels strike our industrial bases, we'll lose our ability to sustain any war. So you're saying the humans have won? Thrain asked coldly. I'm saying we underestimated them at every turn, Corvin replied. They were smarter, more innovative, and more willing to sacrifice than we anticipated. But no, they haven't won. They've bought themselves time and inspired others to resist. If we respond intelligently, we can still restore order. And what does intelligent response look like? Corvin pulled up tactical displays. We split our forces. Half to maintain control of our core worlds and suppress rebellions. Half to find alternate routes to human space and resume the offensive. We also need to adapt our tactics. The humans excel at asymmetric warfare. We need to stop fighting them on their terms and force them into conventional battles where our remaining numerical advantage matters. Thrain nodded slowly. Make it happen. And Corvin, no more surprises. I want detailed intelligence on human capabilities before we engage them again. 6 months passed. In that time, the balance of power in the galaxy shifted in subtle but important ways. The rebellions grew bolder, and Valdren forces were stretched thin trying to maintain control. Humanity continued sharing technology with the rebels, building a network of allies that spanned dozens of systems. On Mars, the production facilities worked around the clock to rebuild the fleet and manufacture more weapons. Dr. Sophie Warren designed a new generation of defensive platforms that could be deployed more quickly. Dr. Helen Carter's team developed variations of the quantum disruption weapons that were less powerful but easier to produce in quantity. Captain Ben Tyler's Nightfall led scouting missions into Valdren space, mapping enemy fleet movements and searching for signs of the alternate route they were seeking. Ben and his crew became legends among both humans and rebels. The ghost ship that appeared from nowhere to strike and vanish. Commander Luke Phillips recovered from his injuries sustained when the Retribution was damaged at the Terminus Gate. The ship itself was repaired and upgraded with new systems. Luke threw himself into training exercises, preparing for the next battle he knew was coming. Vice Admiral Paul Grant was promoted to fleet commander, taking over Jack Morrison's role. It was a position he'd never wanted, haunted by the memory of watching Morrison's ship disappear into the collapsing gate. But Kate Sullivan needed someone she could trust absolutely, and Paul was that person. President Claire Foster addressed the United Earth Assembly on the 6-month anniversary of the Terminus Gate battle. We've achieved something remarkable, she said. We've not only survived against impossible odds, but we've inspired others to fight for their freedom. The human fleet assembled at the edge of known space, far from Earth where Valdren scouts might detect them. Vice Admiral Paul Grant stood on the bridge of the Guardian, looking at the tactical display showing 217 warships ready for departure. It was every combat-capable vessel humanity possessed. If they failed, Earth would be defenseless. All ships report ready, his communications officer announced. Paul opened a fleet-wide channel. This is Grant. In a few minutes, we jump into Valdren space for what may be the final battle of this war. We're not fighting for territory or resources. We're fighting for the right of every species in this galaxy to be free. Some of you won't come home. I wish I could promise otherwise, but I won't lie to you. What I can promise is that if we succeed today, our children and grandchildren will live in a galaxy where might doesn't always make right. He paused, thinking of Jack Morrison and all the others who had already given everything. The Valdren think we're finished. They think the terminus gate broke our spirit. Let's show them how wrong they are. All ships jump on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark. Space twisted as 217 ships vanished into faster-than-light travel, racing toward the Crandor system and destiny. The journey took 3 days. During that time, Captain Ben Tyler's Nightfall and the other stealth ships scouted ahead, mapping Valdran patrol routes and defensive positions. Ben sent constant updates to Paul, painting a picture of a heavily defended system. The rebuilt shipyards were surrounded by defensive platforms, and over 1,000 warships were already assembled with more arriving daily. Dr. Helen Carter, traveling aboard the Guardian as chief technical advisor, studied the sensor data with growing concern. "They're expecting us," she said to Paul. "Look at these defensive positions. They're not arranged for a static defense. They're positioned to intercept a fleet coming from our direction." "Could be coincidence," Paul said, though he didn't believe it. "Could be," Helen agreed. "Or they could have let us learn about this assembly point. Could be a trap." Paul considered that possibility. If it was a trap, turning back now would mean waiting for the Valdran fleet to attack Earth on their terms. If it wasn't a trap and they turned back, they'd miss their best chance to end the war. "We proceed," he decided. "But we go in expecting the worst." In the fighter bays, Lieutenant Chris Baker briefed his squadron for the 10th time. The pilots were tense, running through mental checklists and checking their equipment compulsively. Chris understood. This would be the biggest battle any of them had seen, flying into the teeth of enemy defenses with everything on the line. "Remember your training," Chris said calmly. "The jump drives give us an advantage, but they won't save us if we get sloppy. Work in pairs, watch each other's backs, and don't try to be heroes. We hit fast, we hit hard, and we get out." Tira, the Kelvin pilot who had trained under Chris, raised her hand. She and several other rebel pilots had volunteered to join the human fleet for this mission. "What if the jump drives fail? Then you fly like your ancestors did before they invented fancy technology," Chris said with a slight smile. "You fly smart, you fly scared, and you fly home. Any other questions?" There were none. "Good, get some rest. We drop out of FTL in 6 hours." Commander Luke Phillips walked through the Retribution, speaking with his crew. The battleship had been through hell at the terminus gate and come out fighting. Many of the crew had served with Jack Morrison before his loss, and they carried that legacy with them. Luke made sure each section knew their role in the coming battle, and that they understood how much was riding on their performance. In engineering, his chief engineer, a woman named Kelly Ross, was running final diagnostics on the quantum disruption cannons. "Commander, these systems are pushing beyond design limits. We've fired them in anger 3 times now, and they're showing stress fractures. I can't guarantee they'll hold up in a sustained engagement." "Do your best," Luke said. "If we win, we'll have time to rebuild. If we lose, it won't matter if the cannons are damaged." Kelly nodded grimly and went back to work. The fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Crandor system. Immediately, alarms sounded across every ship as sensors detected the Valdran forces. Helen Carter's worry had been justified. It was absolutely a trap. The Valdran fleet wasn't just expecting them, they were ready and waiting. "Contact," the sensor officer reported. "Counting 2,300 enemy warships. They're moving to intercept." Paul Grant felt his stomach drop, but his voice remained steady. "All ships battle formation Delta. Stealth ships, begin your runs. Fighter squadrons, launch when ready." Fleet Marshal Corvin watched from his flagship as the human fleet entered his carefully prepared trap. He had learned from his previous encounters with these infuriating creatures. They were cunning, innovative, and willing to take insane risks. So he had prepared accordingly. His fleet outnumbered them 10 to 1, and he had positioned his ships to prevent the humans from using their jump tactics effectively. "All batteries, open fire the moment they're in range," Corvin ordered. "No mercy this time. We end this threat once and for all." The battle began with a devastating exchange of fire. Valdran plasma weapons lit up space, and human quantum disruption beams answered in kind. Ships on both sides began to die immediately. The Retribution took a direct hit that knocked out its forward shields, but Luke Phillips kept the battleship in formation, returning fire with secondary weapons. Ben Tyler's Nightfall led the stealth destroyers in a desperate attack on the Valdran command ships. They appeared and disappeared, striking and vanishing, but the Valdran were ready this time. Their sensor nets had been upgraded, making stealth less effective. One destroyer, the Shadow, took concentrated fire and exploded in a brilliant flash. Chris Baker's fighter squadron danced through the chaos, their jump drives allowing them to avoid the worst of the defensive fire. But there were too many enemy ships, too many weapons. Pilots started dying, their fighters transformed into brief fireballs. Tira's fighter took a glancing hit that damaged her jump drive, forcing her to rely on conventional propulsion. She flew like her life depended on it because it did. On the Guardian, Paul Grant watched his fleet being torn apart. They were inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy, but the math was simple and brutal. The Valdren could afford to lose ships. Humanity could not. At this rate, the human fleet would be wiped out within hours. Dr. Helen Carter stood beside him, her mind racing through possibilities. There had to be something they could do, some advantage they hadn't exploited. Then it hit her. Paul, the shipyards, we're not here to win a fleet battle. We're here to destroy their ability to wage war. Paul understood immediately. All ships' new priority target. Ignore the enemy fleet. Focus everything on the shipyards and production facilities. Maximum firepower. The human ships turned their weapons away from the enemy warships and toward the massive orbital structures. Quantum disruption beams sliced through the shipyards, causing them to come apart. Missiles slammed into fuel depots, creating secondary explosions that rippled through the industrial complex. Corvin realized what they were doing and tried to reposition his fleet, but it was too late. The humans were conducting a suicide run, accepting their own destruction to deny the Valdren their industrial capacity. Within minutes, the shipyards that had taken years to rebuild were reduced to expanding clouds of debris. But the cost was terrible. Nearly half the human fleet was destroyed or disabled. The Guardian took multiple hits, fires breaking out on several decks. Paul Grant was injured when an explosion on the bridge threw him against a bulkhead, but he refused medical attention. Then something unexpected happened. New contacts appeared on sensors, emerging from FTL at multiple points around the system. At first, Paul thought it was Valdren reinforcements and his heart sank. But the identification codes were different. These were rebel forces, ships from the Kelvin, the Corinth miners, and a dozen other species. Drex, the Kelvin factory overseer turned resistance leader, transmitted on an open channel. Human ships, this is the Free Species Coalition. We're here to help. The rebel fleet wasn't as advanced as the human ships, but they had numbers and determination. More importantly, many of them were flying ships they had built themselves in Valdren shipyards. Ships with deliberately installed weaknesses they knew how to exploit. The battle's momentum shifted dramatically. Corvin watched in disbelief as the rebel forces engaged his fleet. The ships he had thought were safely under his control turned out to have been sabotaged. Weapons failed at critical moments. Shields collapsed under stress. Ships that should have been battle-ready fell apart when they maneuvered too hard. Retreat, Corvin ordered, his voice bitter. All ships withdraw from the system. But even in retreat, the Valdren paid a heavy price. The human and rebel forces harassed them every step of the way, destroying stragglers and damaged vessels. By the time the Valdren fleet jumped away, they had lost over 1,000 ships and all their shipbuilding capacity in the Crandor system. The human fleet limped back toward Earth, carrying their wounded and their dead. Of the 217 ships that had started the mission, only 93 made it home. But they had accomplished